It's time for the Kim Hammer Show, where you'll learn how your state government affects you, your family, and community. Here's Kim Hammer.
Good afternoon on what is overcast Saturday afternoon. We've got to keep an eye out on the weather. If the forecasters are accurate, might get a little dicey this evening. So be sure to keep your eye on the weather and stay in tune with what's going on weather-wise. And also just thank you for joining us here on the Kim Hammer Show today. We're going to get right into it because we got a full hour. I've got back in studio today Clint Lancaster, who is a attorney in Benton. A little bit of notoriety. He was the one that sued Joe Biden's son for the paternity suit, right?
That's correct.
And was successful in that. But also he worked on the Trump campaign up in Madison, Wisconsin, working on some of the election results and some of the challenges that were going on with that. And then I've got former Representative Doug House, who's an attorney. Doug, you're speaking in your personal capacity today. Is that correct?
No, I've been given permission to speak on behalf of the Attorney General as well.
Okay. All right. So speaking on behalf of, but also with his legislative career in the House, he's also very proficient in the election laws here in the state of Arkansas. And part of what the show is going to be about today, just so you can get a grasp for where we're going with this, is we had Clint, who worked in the election results up in Madison, Wisconsin, and challenging some of those. And we got Doug that's been helping deal with some election laws here and take a look at some of the things that have happened here in Arkansas. And we're going to take a look at similarities. So let's pick up by asking, first of all, Clint, just for those that weren't able to listen last week, what were some of the things that you saw that occurred? And all this, I want y'all are on record now, okay? All of this needs to be factual. I know that a lot of people have some speculation as far as what happened, and there's mixed results depending on what you hear at various news outlets around the nation. But what I would ask both of y'all to do is that if I'm ever called into question because of my character of not just making stuff up on the show, would want you to be able to produce evidence that showed the things that you're going to take positions on today could actually be proven if you were called into a court of law or testified before a committee here in Arkansas, which incidentally, there is a committee meeting that will be taking place toward the end of May where we're going to air out some of this stuff and we're going to bring to light some things that hopefully will make for a better election process in the future. That's for another day. So with that being said, as the disclaimer for the Kim Hammer Show today, as we talk about elections, Clint, what were some things that you saw that you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you could prove in a court of law that you saw happen up in Madison, Wisconsin?
So we saw a lot of absentee ballots that did not follow the statutory scheme that was required by the legislature. And we saw that those ballots were still counted by the authorities, even though the legislature said they were not. And so that was one of the biggest things that we saw. We saw city clerks skirting the absentee balloting laws in just various ways. The majority of the problems we saw were within absentee ballots.
Okay. So where are they today as far as with what was done there? And if you have the ability to speak as far as other places that the same irregularities occurred, you know, such as down in Georgia or up in Ohio or the other states where there were questions, is that a common theme that is kind of across all the areas that were kind of identified as problematic, or was it just isolated to Madison?
I feel confident that the absentee balloting issues are pretty prevalent throughout all the states. For example, in Georgia, they were able to register for voting and get balloting that way. But so whether it's the registering to vote or the ability to get a ballot that doesn't happen on election day, those are some serious issues that we're seeing across the country.
And with regards to what were they doing with the absentee, you talked about them skirting around the laws. What were some of the laws that they were breaking, and will they ever be brought, in your opinion, to justice, that if indeed they did break the law, you just can't let something like that, you know, go unattended. So what exactly were they doing with the absentee process, number one? And then number two, what do you know as far as what they're doing to hold those people accountable?
So some of the things they would do is they would tell voters to list themselves as indefinitely confined, so they would not have to produce ID. They would not take the voters. The voter has to put their address down on their witness signature, and they wouldn't do that, but they would count the ballot. There were some ballots that weren't initialed. And when I was in here last week, I didn't know to the extent that what criminal penalties would be out there. But since then, I have learned that the Wisconsin legislature is issuing subpoenas to not just Dane and Milwaukee County, but up in Green Bay and other places for records relating to voting. And I'm not at liberty to say what I know about that, but I think that based off that, you may see some criminal penalties coming in the future.
I'd be curious to get connected with the individuals up there so that we could maybe do the same thing down here. And are they doing that in other states as well? Are the other legislatures, are they investigating to the level like what they're doing in Wisconsin? Do you know?
I haven't heard of anyone other than Wisconsin, but I'm also more connected to Wisconsin because I was on the Trump legal team in Wisconsin.
I'd be curious, make some connections with people in Georgia, if you can use your connections to get, some folks to be on the show that can give insight too, because if it's almost like taking a 1,000-piece puzzle that's been dumped on the table and you don't have the benefit of the box and the picture of the finished product and you're having to build the puzzle back, knowing that something happened. So I'd be interested in get some, if you can work on that, I'd appreciate it. Doug, absentee here in the state of Arkansas, did you see anything that caused you to have the same concern that Clint had up in Madison?
What I saw, I want to talk about what I put my eyes on, and I could say, yeah, I saw this with my own eyes. There's an organization called 4RAR State or 4R People. They set up a tent outside the courthouse in Pulaski County and were receiving ballots from people who had been contacted by someone. I think I know who, but I don't know who did. But people would bring their ballots over corrected or making corrections or getting something fixed. And this group of people would look through the ballots and then they would take them into the clerk's office. That makes them bearers under law, every state of the union.
Define bearers just for the benefit of people.
A bearer is somebody that carries your ballot to the clerk's office. Now, if you're grandma and you can't drive and you give it to your grandson, he's a bearer. If a guy comes around like Mr. Hallam did a few years ago and gives you a chicken dinner and a bottle of vodka and then takes your absentee ballot and takes it to the courthouse, he's a bearer too. And there's very specific requirements of anybody that carries somebody else's ballots. So I saw that with my own eyes, saw them receiving ballots and carrying them into the courthouse. We saw ballots that were found to be illegal or improper or uncompleted that would not qualify as legal votes in Pulaski County. And somehow, some way or another, they left the election commission and went back to the clerk's office. So they went back to the clerk's office, and then they came back corrected. I saw that with my own eyes because they were there one day, they were gone the next. Did I see who did it? No, I didn't. But I know it happened when I turned my back or left for the day. We got ballots. We had one report. And I may have the numbers wrong, 10,000 or 20,000. It was quite a number of ballots. The clerks, one of the deputy clerks came and testified to the election commission that they had 99.96% of these were accurate. And that meant only a few dozen votes were actually had to be corrected or disqualified. That's a mathematical impossibility. But we kept seeing votes all the way after Election Day keep filtering back from the clerk's office, and they were found, so to speak. I saw absentee ballots. I happened to, myself and another individual, we actually did a thorough search of the Election Commission headquarters, the tabulation room. We looked in every box and
Now, when you say we, who's we?
Well, I'd like to keep his name out of it because
All right.
he hadn't given me permission to use it. But he and I walked through the building, checked every wastebasket, every box, all the machines to see if there were any more ballots laying around. That was 11:30 on the night of the 13th. On the morning of the 14th, it was an all-night session for the Election Commission. All of a sudden, a box of absentee ballots just magically appears. Now, who brought them in? I don't know. I had to leave at 11:30 for a medical issue, but I was headed back over there and then found out that they had found another box of ballots in a room that I personally inspected. There were no ballots in there. Somebody brought them in. I don't know where they came from. So, this kind of stuff was going on the whole election cycle. Way after Election Day, ballots kept filtering in. They just kept appearing in boxes.
So let's do this, just so everybody understands what the absentee ballot process is, especially with this being an unusual year. Now, Wisconsin, they had the what about their balloting process, absentee balloting process up there, especially with the mail-in and everything? What do you know enough to talk about, Clint, how the process worked and what the law said about absentee balloting up there?
Yes, sir. I'm very familiar with Wisconsin's law.
Take us from the beginning and walk us all the way through. Then what we're going to do, then I'm going to get you, Doug, to take and walk us all the way through here to see what the similarities between the states are. So go ahead.
Sure. So in Wisconsin, they don't have an early voting statute. All voting that occurs before Election Day is absentee voting. Now, with that said, there's two types of absentee voting. There is one where a voter requests an absentee ballot. That ballot is sent to the voter, and the voter sends it back. And then there is a period of time that is very similar to our early voting statutes where you can have in-person absentee balloting. And so that's the two things that you see. So while they're not called early voting, it's technically a form of early voting. And so we would see problems in the mail-in about how they're requested, where they picked them up, where they requested them at. And then there were problems that when they'd come in during that in-person absentee voting period where they wouldn't have the initials and things of that nature. And to touch on this issue just really quickly, where Mr. House was talking about changes in the ballots, one thing I don't know if I've mentioned to you, and I'll just preface this by saying I was kind of uniquely positioned in Wisconsin because I was on the floor of the recount in Dane County, so I saw these ballots. I saw these errors with my own eyes, and then I got to join the Trump legal team and formulate these errors into our legal strategy. And so what we would see is if an absentee voter left their address off, the clerk would take a red pen and she would go Google that person's address and write it on there in red ink. And when we went in there, we could only take purple or a green pen in. Everything else was because we were looking for that red. I can't tell you the number of times the clerk themselves would go in there and write on the ballot.
What's the problem with that?
Well, the problem is they're filling in the voter's address. They're filling in information that the voter's supposed to put in. For example, their address is a very important component. And if the voter forgot or left it off, they're going to Google to find out if this voter is even qualified to vote in Wisconsin. So that means like you go and say, well, their address at one point was such and such in Dane County. Well, I'm going to write that on there. Well, they may be living down in Milwaukee and have voted in Milwaukee County or in Chicago or somewhere like that. So that's the process. To answer your question, that's the process for absentee balloting in Arkansas. And then we also saw some of the same things that Mr. House had that was, but we had red ink. And the clerks admitted that they wrote on the ballots, which technically is a crime. You're not supposed to change the voter's ballot.
What's the penalty for the crime up there for something like that? Do you know, or have you gotten into it?
I haven't looked into it because, like I said last time, we were focused on changing these outcomes in the elections rather than pushing crimes. But I imagine that by that final report comes out of Wisconsin, I'll be able to tell you.
Okay. So, Doug, what about the absentee process here? Similar, difference?
Similar, a few differences. Because of the pandemic, the governor opened up absentee ballots. You didn't, if you were afraid of getting the COVID, then you could request an absentee ballot and check medical condition. And everybody considered that was a reasonable response because people didn't want to come out to the polls. So we had early voting. The biggest problem I saw, I can't recall the numbers off my head, but you're supposed to fill out an affidavit that says where you live, who you are, and you're supposed to provide identification. But if you don't have any identification, you can just sign your name and say, I'm who I say I am. Well, I could say I'm Kim Hammer and sign one of those things and it would be counted. That happened a lot. It's called an affidavit. There were a few technical difficulties that are pretty common. I mean, somebody forgets to put the right date on it, or they put their birth date where it calls for the date, things like that are small issues that the Election Commission can reconcile and take care of. But there were thousands of these affidavits. Instead of producing an ID, people just signed an affidavit and see, yeah, that was me that requested that. Yeah, I'm who I say I am. And we don't know if they are or not.
But how would you know who they are? What needs to be done in the process in order to clean that up? And by it being what you just said it is, how does that create opportunity for people to either commit fraud or to inappropriately handle those? What's the problem with that?
Well, the problem with that is and I know this happened in another county. Got some testimony about that last week. A clerk would call a particular person that they know and said, I'm mailing out all the absentee ballots to this neighborhood today. So 2 days later, somebody follows along behind the postman and goes and knocks on doors and say, hey, would you like to have a chicken dinner and a bottle of vodka?
Now, can you verify that, or are you just speculating on that one? Don't get me in trouble.
His last name was Hallam, West Memphis. He got sentenced in federal court how many years ago? Yes, sir. It absolutely does happen. I do know that the clerk, I've got a person that could testify, yes, the clerk was calling somebody and they would go and knock on doors. There's nothing illegal about that. They didn't call the people that represent both parties. They just called the representative of one party, and you can figure out which one that is.
Yeah, but now was that the clerk doing that, or was that somebody following up behind?
Somebody in the clerk's office.
Because here's part of, we want people to get out to vote, but we want to protect the integrity of the vote too. And if the process creates flaws to where integrity of the vote cannot be protected, that's the areas that we need to drill down on, in my opinion, in order to make sure what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, because both parties want people to get out and to vote, obviously, for their candidate. So what is acceptable and legal versus what is not?
There was a day when signature verification was thought to be reliable. It's not. We can't, lay people can't tell the difference between one signature and the next, and as time goes by, our signatures change. Representative Mark Lowry's got a bill that I think it may be a constitutional amendment or it may be a bill, I'm sorry, I can't remember that says everybody will produce ID. And so when somebody says, well, I don't have an ID, the clerk is duty bound to go to that person and give them an ID. And they can send in their ID with their ballot, prove who they are, got a picture with it, identify it, and that'll work. The equipment's been provided by the state to every clerk in the state's office, in the state by the Secretary of State's office, and they have an obligation to provide the necessary identification if they don't have something. Now, I can't make a copy. That would be a real problem. Then send it in, we'll send it back. That's the way we can do that.
Send what in?
The ID.
You're talking about like if somebody sends in their driver's license?
Well, they can send in a driver's license or some other form of identification, got their picture on it. If they can't make a copy, sure, they could do that. Please send this back. We'll do it.
Signature verification issue up in Madison County, or do they even require that up there?
So in Madison, they didn't. What we constantly heard was, we're not signature experts. We can't tell if this is the same signature or not, and the legislature didn't require that. But, to Mr. House's point, I think it's kind of hard to find somebody in this time and age that doesn't have a phone with a camera who can't take a picture of their driver's license and at least email it to the clerk or get your grandkid to do it. I mean, it's not that complicated.
Amen.
And so if you don't have the signature on there, or if the signature is an out of date, thus the reason for the photo ID in order to be able to verify that whoever sent that in. Let me ask you to do this before we get to the bottom of the hour. So go back in Arkansas. Let's just use Arkansas. When it comes to the absentee ballot, I think there was like 111,000 that was cast this time. A lot of that was because of the COVID scare, people, being afraid to get out to vote. Of course, I'll be honest with you, I always have a little bit of an issue with that because you see them in the stores and you see them out doing everything else, but you can't, you can't go vote. But anyway, that's another gripe session. But people, there obviously was an uptick in the absentee ballot. At the same time, I don't know that we'll see that turn down, because I think people have gotten used to the convenience of getting the absentee ballot So we're down to making sure that the absentee ballot process is as pure as it can be. Do you guys think that, just on your own personal level, you think that the absentee will go down, stay where it is, or go up? 111,000, I think, in the state this time. Y'all got any personal opinion?
A personal opinion, I think it will go down a little, but not much, because the rules were relaxed so much. You basically, all you had to do is check a box and say I'm scared that I might get the virus. Though people, and most people are honest. So most people from now on will say, I've had my shots. I'm good to go. And so I think there'll be some reduction, but it won't be a substantial amount. Maybe.
What do you
20%.
think, Clint?
I'm not afraid of the honest people. I think that it will depend deeply on how much the parties push absentee balloting and the reason behind it. I think if the Democratic Party or any party finds we really could exploit this system because the loopholes aren't fixed, they'll exploit them simply because they would rather cheat and win than do it honest. It's not the honest people I worry about.
Amen.
So what are the loopholes?
The loopholes are things like not having to produce an ID. The thing where I say I'm medically confined. Well, nobody checked to see what medically confined meant. And we had the same thing kind of up in Wisconsin with indefinitely confined. You got to have some verification on that. One thing I think that Arkansas has, I don't know if they have it or they should, is if those signatures can't match up or you can't provide an ID, then you don't get to vote absentee, because absentee voting is not a right. It's a privilege. The right is voting on election day.
But, depending on who you listen to, everybody promotes it as a right. And I think that's a messaging campaign as far as, is it a right or is it a privilege, or what is it to be able to vote?
Well, it's the Supreme Court's actually spoke on that. The Supreme Court has said that the process for casting an absentee ballot must be followed religiously and astutely and completely, as opposed to voting in person. That all of those requirements have to be met, and that's what the Supreme Court has said. On absentee ballot, back a long time ago, it used to be you had to have a doctor's certificate if you said you were sick or something. Well, the Supreme Court said, no, you don't have to do that, and nobody can be questioned about their medical reason. And matter of fact, our Amendment 81 that we passed a number of years ago says you can't question anybody about their ballot, but you can question their identity. And that's right. He's got it right. You got to have an ID. You got to verify. Whoever says they're voting can prove who they are by a picture ID issued by the government in some way, shape, or fashion. Another problem that came up, it seems like people who had Republican connections that requested a ballot did not receive a ballot, an absentee ballot. Particularly Carlton Wings got 3 kids. They're all 3 missionaries. They requested an absentee ballot in a timely manner, never got it, never saw it. He tried to fix it when it looked like it was about a week left. Oh, we've mailed that out. No, they didn't. Well, we mailed it to where they used to live. We're sorry. We feel real bad. That was every time we caught somebody doing something, it was, oh, I messed up. I'm sorry. I really feel bad about that. I won't do it again.
You got 1 minute. So let me give this to y'all to think about. We'll come back after the break and answer it. When it comes to the process of the absentee, how far out can the absentee ballot be requested? And it is then to be mailed out. I want to talk about the timetable of what I want to talk about with the absentee ballot when we come back. All right, you're listening to the Kim Hammer Show. I have Clint Lancaster, who is an attorney in Benton. He and his wife, Jennifer, run a very successful attorney practice down in Benton. They were also part of the Trump legal team assigned to Madison, Wisconsin. And then also I have Doug House, former state representative, who is knowledgeable from firsthand experience of some of the things that were witnessed in the last election process. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the timeline of when a person can get an absentee ballot, when it has to be turned in, what's trying to be done at the national level to usurp the process or to weaken the process. And then we're going to move on to a couple different topics. You're listening to the Kim Hammer Show here on 101.1 FM, The Answer.
Take The Answer with you anywhere with our free mobile app, 1011fmtheanswer.com. Tune in, iHeart, or radio.com. Breaking news and stimulating talk. 101.1 FM, The Answer.
You're probably listening to this radio program because you want to drop your energy bills. And now there's a great new resource to help slam the door on ever-rising energy costs. DropYourEnergyBill.com is America's free source for business and home energy savings.
Famous Fresco for more than 20 years, the absolute best in air purification. Visit frescohealth.com or call 877-224-1447. That's frescohealth.com. Call or visit them online today.
Attention RNs. Needing a job or a different assignment? Arkansas Medical Staffing is immediately hiring for 2 adolescent psych nurses for a long-term assignment Monday through Friday, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. All our jobs are local. Yes, local. We'll pay a $500 sign-on bonus for this job. They need you, and Arkansas Medical Staffing need you. Call Arkansas Medical Staffing today, 501-224-1010, or send your resume to info@arkansasmedicalstaffing.com. Arkansas Medical Staffing, keeping Arkansas nurses right here at home.
Big Rock Fun Park is a playground in the sky, land, and water.
Experience more thrills safely on our high ropes course with our new continuous belay system. Get some exercise. Enjoy mini golf, batting cages, and go-karts, all on 7.5 acres.
Check out the arcade and enjoy your favorite food.
Free admission and parking.
Couples bring friends for a double date fun time for all ages.
Open 7 days a week. Hours subject to weather changes. Come for an hour or the afternoon.
There's more info at bigrockfunpark.com.
Imagine doing one thing that gives you an entirely different perspective about your place in the world. Think it would be worth it? Hi, it's Mike Gallagher, hoping you can join me for a 10-day Stand with Israel tour through the land of Israel, October 2021. Join us. Get firsthand insight into Israel's fascinating past and promising future. We'll learn about the geopolitical, economic, and spiritual dynamics of one of the most fascinating countries on earth, but you'll share experiences that'll change how you read scripture, walk the ancient temple steps, touch the western wall, sail on the Sea of Galilee, pray on the Mount of Beatitudes. The list goes on and on. Return home inspired, renewed, and empowered. Now listen, if you've ever dreamed of seeing Israel, this is your chance. Join me October 2021, and right now register worry-free. Peace of mind, guaranteed refunds up to May 8th if for any reason you want to cancel. So to come along, call 855-565-5519, 855-565-5519, or go to standwithisraeltour.com, standwithisraeltour.com.
Welcome back to the Kim Hammer Show. Again, on a overcast Saturday afternoon, make sure that you keep your eye on the weather based on the forecast. Might get a little dicey tonight. Remember, 6 o'clock tonight, the Razorbacks play. Hopefully you are a Razorback fan, because it would be nice to get to the 8. Let's say we're going to the 8 or the 16.
I couldn't tell you. I haven't watched basketball in
16.
years.
We're in the Sweet 16. Yeah, we're going to get to the next level. Sorry, I had a little bit of
Crazy
a
eight.
Elite
crazy
eight. Elite eight.
Elite. That's it. But anyway, either way, we want them to win. Let's get back to the subject at hand, which is dealing with election issues. Some things that Clint Lancaster, Jennifer, who's home with the kids and doing a Bible study.
Yes, sir.
So kudos to her. But they were stationed up in Madison, Wisconsin, and Doug House saw some things firsthand here in the state of Arkansas. So before we move on the early ballot, requesting of an early ballot, what are the time frames of when you can request it? How far out from the actual election itself? Here in Arkansas.
Well, in Arkansas, you can make a request for absentee ballots, plural, anytime during the year, and it's good for the remainder of the year. And you can request for just one election or all elections. So that can be filed at any time, and even before the candidates have announced. And like school board elections or municipal elections, whatever, yeah, they'll send you a ballot if there's going to be an election in your district.
Even though they don't know who's going to be on the ballot at the time, you're just getting the request in, basically, is what you're doing.
Correct. And think about soldiers, people overseas, and people working overseas. They're not going to be here right before an election. So they will, well, when I deployed, I put in my request, and I got most of the election ballots that came up in my district. I missed one on gambling. They didn't send me one for gambling. I didn't get a chance to fuss about that. But other than that, I got 3 or 4 ballots during my deployment.
So when you request it, then you're automatically on it. So whenever the election comes up, they know who or what issue is going to be on the ballot, that they should automatically send it to you. When should you start getting concerned that you haven't gotten it? Because you cited a situation a while ago where somebody had not gotten it. What's a good time frame for people to start asking for it if they haven't received it?
If you're out of state, you almost probably 30 days. I'm sorry. If you're out of state, probably 30 days. If you're overseas, there's probably not much you're going to be able to do about it unless you can get in touch with them by mail or email. But if you're inside the country, probably 30 days to get a hold of them. They have to verify they hadn't sent you one, where it went to, et cetera, et cetera. But probably 20 days, no less than 20 days.
So then as far as how long it can be turned in or up to what time can it be turned in order for it to legally be counted?
Well, overseas ballots, they have to be in by 10 days after the election. And just from personal experience, like overseas, the mail truck gets blown up and your ballot doesn't make it, So they give you an extra 10 days on overseas ballot. Otherwise, I think all ballots have to be in by election day if they're inside the country. That's my recollection.
Including being mailed back in?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, which that was part of the concern, if I remember right, we had this time, was because they did anticipate such a heavy volume of ballots being mailed in. They allowed them to start doing something with them earlier just because of the sheer volume that they were anticipating. So as far as mail-in ballots, which was one thing that was pushed in a lot of other states, what was the experience with the mail-in ballots? Not the request for the absentee ballots, but just the mailing.
The mailed-in ballots were the ones that had a lot of the defects that didn't meet the statutory requirements. Those were the ones that the clerks were writing in red ink on. Those were the ones that didn't have complete addresses. It's kind of like a lot of other things in the legal industry. If you leave it into the hands of your individual people, the odds of them messing something up go up higher and higher. And so that's kind of what we saw there, was that they just didn't comply because they didn't meet the formalities. And it's supposed to be a drop dead type of standard. And so that's what we saw on the mail-in ones where they were mailed in. Of course, and you could also return them. You could return them to the clerk's office. And then what Wisconsin did in Dane County was they created a bunch of drop boxes, which were funded by an entity connected to Facebook. And these were unmanned drop boxes prohibited by or not allowed by the Wisconsin statute. And you could just go drop your ballot off there when the statute said you either mailed it in or you returned it to the clerk's office.
You think that's part of what they'll be investigating up there?
I think so. I think they'll be, and if they're not, I think they should be looking at the connections with that group, because that group is a private entity that funneled a bunch of money in to the Wisconsin clerks for drop boxes and things like that. And they're not pushing a conservative agenda.
Now, you mentioned democracy in the park. Was that what you called it last week?
Yes, sir. That's what it was. That was the Madison city clerk opened up every park in Madison, Wisconsin on 2 different Saturdays for people to come in and request absentee ballots or have their absentee ballots witnessed and notarized or anything that needed to happen. And that was not something that the Wisconsin statutory scheme permitted. That was not, you can't do that. If you were going to do that, you had to designate that by like March or May, and we're talking August, September.
Even under emergency situations, governor's emergency rule, that wasn't allowed up there.
So Wisconsin is a unique state that they got some really interesting litigation, but those issues were litigated about whether the governor or whether they could suspend absentee voting thing. Went to federal court and went all the way up to the 7th Circuit, and they said, no, we're not going to. And then I think it went, 7th Circuit gave them something, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no. So these were issues. There were about 3 or 4 pre-litigation federal lawsuits out of Wisconsin.
Okay. And that was one thing we didn't touch on last week. Let me just kind of divert from the conversation here. You guys were working in Wisconsin. You had teams down in Georgia. You had teams in all the states that were the controversial states. Was it a foot race as to who could get to the Supreme Court first? You talked about trying to get to the lower courts and everything, but were y'all working in conjunction, or were you working against each other in some cases? Or what was the ultimate goal to get a case before the Supreme Court? And if so, for the purpose of what?
I mean, to my experience, in my opinion, is it was kind of like guerrilla litigation where nobody's working against each other, but we're not necessarily all working together. We're just attacking in force as hard as we can. And the theories varied across state to state because the issues came up differently according to unique state law from state to state. Our goal was just to keep surviving through the next level and getting this case where it needed to the hands of somebody who would make the right decision. And that was our goal.
So based on what you saw in Wisconsin and what you heard from others and looking at Arkansas laws, do you see weaknesses, or are you up to date enough to know about Arkansas laws to identify any potential areas here that would have already taken place somewhere else?
Yes, sir, and I can speak on that if you'd like me to.
Well, go ahead.
So one of the things that I don't see in Arkansas that I saw in Wisconsin was the Wisconsin legislature said specifically in its statute, absentee voting is a privilege, not a right. Okay, and that made it clear that this isn't a right, and you had to comply. And it said if it didn't comply, you don't count the ballot. Number two, Arkansas's got an election contest statute, and what we saw throughout the United States was the equitable defense of latches keep coming up.
That's foreign language to a layman like
Sure.
me. What does that mean?
Latches just means you waited too late. You waited too late to bring this lawsuit. Therefore, your ability to bring it is barred. And so what I think the Arkansas legislature should do is they should put a time limit in the challenge statute. And if you meet that time limit, then latches is not an affirmative defense. And Arkansas gets to do that because the way we are structured, the legislature makes substantive law, and Amendment 80 says the courts make procedural law. So this is a substantive defense that the legislature can take out of the hands of people who may not want to have these or hear these challenges.
Anything else?
That's all I can think about right now. Give me some time, I might think of some more.
Well, while you're thinking, Doug, what do you, in response to what he just said?
He's right. It's not in statute. We have a Supreme Court decision that says that on absentee ballots, procedures must be followed exactly. But not everybody reads Supreme Court opinions. They do pay attention to what's in the statute books. So I take that suggestion as excellent. And Arkansas says in the House and Senate that those two bodies are the sole determining officials on who their membership is. The Senate decides who won an election contest. In case of senators, same thing on the House. The House says go even further and go to the State Claims Commission, and then in another place in the statute says go to circuit court. And so it's real unclear about what the jurisdictional process is. Several of us think that when it comes to House and Senate races, they ought to be filed straight with the House and Senate. If it's some other race, then file straight with the circuit clerk. So there's still some debate about that. It's a confusing process, and we just went through that with Cervello case.
So things that you saw based on what you just said, that the Supreme Court is very clear, although some people don't read the Supreme Court cases. Give me the punch list of what you saw with your own eyes, or that you can verify where you think laws were either broken or were not obeyed to be softer.
Well, there were a lot of laws broken, a lot of procedures that were broken, not by any candidate that I ever saw, not that I directly saw any public official.
And let me say something to that case. Sometimes as a candidate, as a sitting official, you want to think that your people are always doing the right thing. You can want them to be doing the right thing, but sometimes that doesn't mean the right thing always gets done. I know of, I won't bring out any names, but in private conversations of a candidate who had a really close race, none of which have been mentioned on the radio today, that candidate, I think, was oblivious to what was going on. And so we just need to I think we need to build a little bit of a firewall that sometimes candidates don't even know sometimes what people are doing because maybe they're in such a fever pitch to want their candidate to win that they'll do things. That's just a sidebar.
People that are in the political parties, they want their candidates to win, and they do, and we saw that they do things that are illegal, plain old illegal. The candidates themselves, I have no criticism of any candidate that ran in any race in any county, including Pulaski. They are all upstanding people, and we're doing doing what they're supposed to do. But there is an essential problem, and that's what the legislature now is taking on. And the Attorney General, I've talked about what I know, but let me tell you what the Attorney General, she supports a lot of this legislative reform that's coming in. Let me give you, for instance, a stop sign does not make any car stop. Go out there and watch it. There's not a stop sign in the world that's going to throw itself down and make a car stop. It's that policeman watching that stop sign that has the power to write a citation and cost you some money, maybe lose your license, whatever it is. Same thing with bank robberies. Bank robberies, we've got laws against bank robberies, but not a law one makes people stop robbing banks. It takes policemen and security systems and so on. It takes an enforcement mechanism to our law. And so if people just choose to totally disregard the law, there's got to be consequences. And that's the same thing is true. We caught one person, I say we caught, one person admitted totally to feeding 350 absentee ballots that were illegal, improper, into the voting machine. They found out he did it. And so what does he do? He writes a letter. I'm sorry. I messed up, made a mistake, feel real bad about it, won't never do it again. That's it. 350 ballots fed into the machine illegally. I'm sorry, I won't do it again. That's not going to work. There are some people that knew that they could break the law and break specific laws with
Sorvillo's case. I mean, you have two showing up on Court Connect. One where the judge says, I don't have subject matter jurisdiction because the election hasn't been certified. And then you have another one saying, well, we're going to have to dismiss with prejudice because you got to go to the Claims Commission. A candidate who's got a limited amount of time to turn around and challenge an election and get the results out so they can be sworn in, that's not time to play footsie or hokey pokey. We need to know where to file, who you file it with, and what the rules are going to be.
So you think that's absent?
I think it's. I don't
or
think
it could be cleared up.
I think it could be more clear because, like Mr. House was saying, you know, do you file it in the House of Reps? Do you file it in the Senate? Do you file it in the Claims Commission? Do you challenge it with the county court? I mean, I just think it could be much more clear to know who you're going to challenge, when, and where, and have a better procedure for challenging.
You get 6 lawyers in a room, and they'll give you 6 different answers and be able to defend each one of them. It's messed up.
And you're looking for a judge who's going to, who the judicial economy says, I'm looking for a reason to dismiss this, any reason to dismiss this. Oh, I got 5 because only they put 1 in. I got 5 other ones. You're out of court.
That happened.
Okay. Let's do this, Doug. Of the bills that are in the hopper, you got them in front of you. Pick out one.
I think the most important bill that the legislature needs to pass is Senate Bill number 557. The sponsor of that is Senator Mark Johnson, and Senator Hammer, you're the co-sponsor on the House side, and there's a whole bunch of representatives. A lot of people don't know this, but a county clerk is not an election official by definition. Now, in the Constitution, she is charged with, or usually it's a she, it could be he, is charged with keeping the registration system and the voter database and that sort of thing. But when you look at the statute definitions of what an election official is, he or she, county clerk, is not listed. So what it says is that the county election commissions in each one of the counties is in charge of the elections. So 557 says that the county election commission can still delegate authority to the county clerk, and about 40 to 45 counties let the clerk run everything because they've run it for a long time. They know what they're doing. They're honest people. They're good people, and they run a clean election. Nobody has complaints about that, so we're going to be able to continue that. But in those few cases, 8 to be exact in the last election, where the county clerk was not running the election properly, then the election commission can withdraw that authority because only an election official can touch a ballot, can touch a machine, can administer the election. And the election commission has the authority to uncertify a person from handling an election. I think that's the most important bill we've got.
When you talk about who is authorized to touch a ballot, I'm going to raise it to this level. I think that the ballot is the equivalent of my wife. Don't touch her.
Exactly.
You know, I'm the only one. So we want to make sure that the ballot accountability process is clean. In Madison, I think you mentioned a while ago, as far as people handling ballots, either cast that day or absentee or mail-in, that weren't supposed to be handling them?
There was one of them, and I can't remember. It was thousands of votes, but one of the clerks, who was supposed to initial, she had gotten married like a week before the election. Well, her married initials were like MEB, but we'd see on election day where they're counting them, or after she was married, it would be MEC, MCA. Clearly different handwriting. And I think that there was some accountability. I made the mistake of touching a ballot when I was on the recount floor, and I got told really quick, you can't touch that ballot again. You're going to be in trouble. And so I understand that. And I think that, some accountability to that level needs to happen, because you can't, if you have so many voters coming in that you can't properly vet them according to the statute, that's a problem. We shouldn't just be letting anybody do it.
What about improperly handling of ballots here?
Well, it specifically says only an election official can handle the ballots and run the election. If you're not an election official, or if you're decertified, which the Election Commission can do, then if you touch a ballot, it can be a misdemeanor up to a year. It can be a Class D felony up to 6 years in prison.
It's just a matter of proving or somebody actually filing a complaint against somebody?
Well, it's even a little more than that. The prosecuting attorney has to prosecute. Now, as the attorney, that's coming up too. If the prosecuting attorney is depending on the county government, quorum court, and the county judge for his budget, is he going to prosecute those same people that control his budget? And that's beginning to look like a problem, because the definition of voter fraud in some people's vocabulary is, well, they were prosecuted and convicted. We saw voter fraud. Has any of it been prosecuted? No.
What is voter fraud? What rises to the level of voter fraud?
Breaking the voter laws with intent to influence the election.
But how do you determine intent? I mean, that's a pretty serious accusation, but it's also pretty challenging, or is it, to prove?
Almost every law, criminal law, and there's a few exceptions we don't need to go into, almost every criminal law requires either intentional conduct, knowledgeable conduct, reckless conduct, negligent conduct, and you infer or you deduce the intention from the circumstances. If I pull out a gun, aim it at you deliberately, and shoot you, it looks pretty much like that I intended to shoot you. If I shoot a gun over in your direction and knowing that it might hit you, then I have knowledge. And so you infer from the circumstances what the level of intent is. Sometimes they say, I meant to kill him. I meant to rob the bank. And sometimes it's, I accidentally ran over that person. Well, those are the kinds of things that the law goes into. Same thing with voters.
So like going back to your illustration of 250 ballots that were fed into the machine, and then a letter of apology, basically, would that be an example of something that you have to determine intent versus accident?
His letter admitted negligence.
Okay.
Even after he was told, don't count those ballots. Oh, we put them in the wrong box. I'm sorry. I feel real bad about it. Won't never do it again.
But did they get counted or not?
Yeah, they counted. Changed the election.
Okay.
And here's my thoughts on that. So, I'm a first-time offender. I've never been in trouble. But if I'm going to cheat in an election to get my candidate in there, I'm looking at probably probation. I might get to go to jail on the weekends. That's a small price to pay for my candidate holding office. If the legislature doesn't do something about getting that candidate out of office, all the criminal penalties in the world aren't going to make the changes that need to happen. That candidate who cheated, or who had someone cheat for him or got the benefit of it, has to pay that penalty, because you're not going to see changes otherwise.
That's true.
So you think it ought to be the candidate?
I think the legislature ought to say, if we have 350 ballots that were improperly counted, we draw down 350 ballots, because that didn't comply, and we may just have another election, or have some way to where it affects the outcome of the election, because that's what everybody's really looking for.
And we have an interesting provision. I believe it's 81, but I'm not positive. Amendment 81. You cannot question anybody. The government, take that back. The government cannot question anyone about who they voted for. Used to be they would interview voters and say, well, who'd you vote for? Well, I voted for him, and her. And you could put on proof that that person voted illegally, then that ballot's thrown out or another one's thrown out or whatever, and you can change the results. That went away with that amendment because even the courts, by the constitutional amendment, cannot ask somebody how they voted in the absence of fraud.
You know, everybody probably thinks that as an elected official, you remember everything, but a lot of water goes under the bridge, okay? But I remember last session, maybe a couple sessions ago, some of the election laws that we were looking at. One of the things that came up, it was a bill that had good intent, but the consequences were not going to be good because I remember the way it was structured that you could actually get down in a small enough election. You could tell by the process that was going to be established by that bill who actually voted for who. And fortunately, that got caught, you know, and changed so that it wouldn't be that way. Back to you, what you said a minute ago, though, Clint, you're not saying actually hold the candidate responsible. What you're saying is that if you can prove in the case of the 250 ballots that those ballots were illegally handled, or let's just say improperly handled, and there was evidence to it, you think that number ought to be backed out of it to get to who truly had what number.
Yes, sir. I think the legislator should say absentee voting is a privilege. If you don't fully comply with our absentee laws, we don't count the ballot. These signatures didn't comply. These ballots shouldn't have been counted. So while the candidate did nothing wrong, we will draw down those ballots. We will throw them out. We will set them aside because that's what really makes the election fair. Putting somebody in jail who took a red pen to ballots isn't going to make the right outcome in the election.
What if I want to mishandle the other party? Say I'm party X and I'm handling the ballots and I single out party Y intentionally and mishandle them for the purpose of getting those ballots thrown out.
Well, that's a good reason to put somebody in jail, but it's also a good reason to go back and count those ballots that were mishandled because the candidate did nothing wrong, and we shouldn't have voters getting, quote, disenfranchised because of the malice of a clerk.
When it comes to privilege, we got, I think, 2 minutes left. There's the music coming on. When it comes to privilege, in 30 seconds or less, defend what you said about it's a privilege.
Your right to vote is the right to vote on election day at the polls. It's not to get a ballot and vote from home in your pajamas.
That's exactly what the Supreme Court said. And I agree, totally.
Well, and would you say in Madison, a lot of the issues that were identified weren't necessarily the votes that were cast on election day? It was in the absentee process?
90-something. I'm guessing 90%, but the vast majority of them.
What would you say, Doug?
75%.
Okay. All right. You've been listening. Anything you guys want to say in parting in 15, 20 seconds or less?
Just to say that the Attorney General is also watching this. She's dedicated me during the session to work on this on behalf of the people. She's keenly interested in it and is on my case whenever she needs to be to make sure that we're pushing it. Well, and I don't like losing, but if I lose, I want to know I lost fair and square. Clint, anything?
Thank you for having me.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you for being back on. We'll put you all on the agenda for a few weeks from now as things rock along. Some of these bills hopefully make their way through the legislature. We'll get back circled up again, and maybe check with your Georgia and other contacts, see if we can bring in somebody else. All right, you've been listening to the Kim Hammer Show here on 101.1 FM. The Answer. For those of you that are watching Facebook Live, thank you for joining us. I'll announce who our guest is going to be next week, and you can follow on Facebook and pick up on that. Hope you have a great Saturday afternoon. Remember, the Razorbacks play at 6 o'clock, but also remember to watch the weather, be mindful, pay attention to those alerts, and stay safe. Thank you for listening to the Kim Hammer Show. You can go to www.kimhammershow.com to follow me on my website. 101. The Answer. KDXE FM, Kamak Village, Little Rock, a Salem Media Group station. 101.1 FM. The Answer.